generalized crisis, that is, caused by the struggle for sovereignty, caused opportunities or created opportunities for persons or groups to seek to advance their respective class, gender, regional, local, religious and linguistic interests, or permutations thereof. Indeed, you might say to advance their own modes of sovereignty. But if you could suggest that a hierarchy of interests emerged or had already been created, then you'd have to fairly say that the national question, of course, was the one that trumped all the others. The other sectional interests nearly always found themselves blocked or ultimately impeded by forces or interests most concerned with national sovereignty. Looking at these matters from the point of view of a properly Marxist or left-wing analysis, one finds that the interests of a professional and industrial bourgeoisie in the north, and a large farmer and professional middle class, and an emerging small bourgeoisie in the south, were finally served by the state system that actually was born in the 1920s. This isn't to say that, of course, there weren't exceptions to this, but I don't think many of us here might dispute that kind of vision. The sovereignty that was sought was legitimized principally in national terms, be they those of Irish national sovereignty or, alternatively, British nationalism and imperialism. That is, the territorial authority that was sought was justified in terms of national identity. It was conceived less as a struggle about class or gender or religion than one is about authority legitimized in terms of national identity, where the nation was a grouping sharing languages, modes of life, a delimited place, a sense of history, a sense of movement and forward purpose. Now you can concede that a secessionist or anti-colonial struggle is always likely to be waged in the terms of national identity. In Ireland, from the Renaissance times of Spencer and Geoffrey Keating, from that time onwards, a long war, we know, was waged, which consisted, on the one hand, of the production by English writers, policymakers, soldiers, administrators, governors, politicians of various kinds, the production by these people of ideological justifications for their interventions and schemes of government in Ireland, and equally the contesting of these ideas, of these English or British legitimizing ideas, by the inhabitants of the island. If the Tudors and their inheritors saw the mere Irish, as they called them, as primitive or inscrutable or barbarous, as incapable of nurturing the land, as incapable of rational self-governance, then their Irish enemies and interlocutors, all the way from the early modern period, right to the literary revival and the revolutionary period, legitimized their resistance, principally by seeking to demonstrate Irish cultural and linguistic sophistication, depth, civilization, capacity for discipline, the ability to shake off the demon drink, the capacity for regional democratic self-determination, or home rule as it was called in the 19th century. In other words, both sides in this struggle recognize Michel Foucault's dictum well ahead of Foucault. Discourse is the power to be seized. If you can dominate the discussion, you can dominate what happens. But the problem with this pattern of domination and resistance from the point of view of the resistor, and from the point of view of the inheritors of the resistors, which is what I think we might aspire to be, is that the process of resistance takes place within a kind of discursive or linguistic or debate logic or framework that has been set in place already, always already, by the offshore power, by the great power. Huge intellectual and cultural energy is expended by the inhabitants of Ireland in seeking to refute or to rebut the charges laid against them of their irrationality, their essential femininity, all these things. But this is all, to engage in this discussion is always already to concede the terrain and the form of the discussion. The other problem is that this debate of ideas is conducted precisely at that level, at the level of ideas and discourse. An overlay of ideas and discourse is produced on both sides, which to a great degree obscures the real material interests that are actually involved. We must also concede the fact, I think, that the primary reason that the national revolution was fought out mainly in regard to national sovereignty is because the primary class cleavage in the country as a whole, that between large farmers and landlords on one hand, and the landless poor, rural tenants and smallholders on the other, I'm talking about the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. This problem, arguably, and this is a huge sweeping statement, and there'll be people here vastly more qualified than myself to correct me on this, but this cleavage had in a certain strong sense, I think, been, if you want, solved at the end of the 19th century. Now that solving seems to mean that I'm endorsing that kind of structure that came into place. I'm not necessarily doing that. What I mean by this is that the two greatest events, I think, of the 19th century in this country, the famine, the catastrophic event of the famine, the catastrophic transformation wrought by the famine, and then the British governmental reaction to the famine, or part reaction to the famine, in the form of the Land Acts of the 1860s onwards, brought about a major class realignment, a major transformation and redistribution of wealth in the country. We know that the famine, in a few terrible years, simply got rid, if you want, of the poorest strata, the poorest levels of Irish society. Largely these rural poor, the landless poor, died or emigrated. You don't have to look very far in the governmental and neoclassical economic literature of the time to see an understanding of the famine amongst both British and Irish administrators, not only as a judgment of God on the feckless Irish, on the improvident poor, but also, of course, as the greatest possible opportunity for the restructuring of the rural economy. But equally, the poor, we must remember, are also those who are least likely to be assimilated into all the great structures of state and society. They are the most likely people to speak Irish and not English. They are the people most likely not to be beneficiaries of state education, to have a fractious relationship with the national police force, to maintain religious practices that fell outside the reforms of the devotional revolution, if you want, the modernisation of the Catholic Church at the end of the 19th century. In other words, the poor who were wiped out by the famine had been those who were most physically remote, most politically and economically remote from the machinery of state and mainstream society. They represented what the critic David Lloyd has called the non-modern in the Irish context. They made up a social formation which was resistant to the assimilative and centralizing forces of the modern state and economy. In a few years, the famine dealt a death blow to this social formation, and that never recovered. In answer to the famine, as we know, the British government, in answer maybe is a bit charitable, but partly in response to the famine, the British government, prodded and driven by the Land League, initiated a process of state-driven land reform. This was carried out in the successive Land Acts. The overall effect of these acts was to destroy the colonial landlord or rentier class, by and large, and to consolidate larger farmers working their own land, and to create the great body of small farmers that have dominated Irish society and politics ever since. But the point here must be not only the profound realignment of class that took place towards the end of the 19th century, but also the fact that the agency involved was ultimately that of the colonial state. Not nationalist Ireland, not the Home Rule movement, not the IRB or the Fenians, not the Irish Parliamentary Party. The sociologist Liam O'Dowd long ago pointed out the consequences of this situation for the intellectual and cultural spheres in decolonising and independent Ireland. In his account of the rise of technocratic, state-orientated and policy-orientated intellectuals within the Lemass-Whitaker modernisation project of the 60s, O'Dowd pointed out that there had also been a significant separation of intellectual spheres. For O'Dowd, the evacuation of the national revolution of any significant social or class content through land reform had produced a fundamentally conservative revolutionary elite, more concerned with the transfer of sovereignty, that word again, from one state to another, than with the transfer of wealth within the social formations of the new state. If issues of social justice and equality had been dealt with, or were being dealt with, by the colonial power, then the intellectuals of the national revolution were most likely to legitimize secession or breakaway on the grounds of cultural separation and distinctiveness. The active intellectuals of the revolutionary period and its aftermath mostly were very young or were born after the land reform process began. And so the new dispensation was part of the social and political terrain which they simply assumed and were uninclined to question. The result of this, according to O'Dowd, is that whether post-independence intellectuals broadly endorsed the new status quo, as we might say of someone like, Daniel Corkery, or if they were critical of it, as we might say of people like O'Foylan or Conor, they tended nevertheless to focus mostly on matters of culture and identity. By the 1960s, the technocrats and the bureaucrats would look after the economy, or base in vulgar Marxist terms, and the superstructure of ideas and cerebration would be left to those labouring in the fields of culture. This meant that mainstream post-independence intellectual culture was characterized by an obsession with identity, which I would argue still plagues us, and seems rarely to be capable of a true structural analysis of Irish society. Frantz Fanon, whom I'm sure whose work I'm sure is known to many people here, in his posthumous masterpiece, The Wretched of the Earth, published in 1961, wrote a fiery and brilliant critique of what he called the pitfalls of national consciousness. Taking a broad overview of African anti-imperialism and decolonization, Fanon conceded the usefulness of nationalism as a phenomenon or movement that offered a powerful narrative or story of coherence, resistance, and independence to an oppressed and fragmented and beaten people. But he also realized at the same time that nationalism is an ambivalent weapon. He anticipated the great Scottish historian Tom Nairn's point that nationalism has two faces. It is Janus-faced in Nairn's formulation. Nationalism projects a community's movement into a future while mostly looking at the past. In other words, nationalism retains some dynamic power up to the point of the creation of the new state, but it then must be immediately further revolutionized if it is not to become what Fanon famously called a sterile formalism. And I'm quoting Fanon here. If nationalism is not made explicit, if it is not enriched and deepened by a very rapid transformation into a consciousness of social and political needs, it leads up a blind alley. In other words, the focus on national identity must be replaced by something much closer to socialism, by an understanding of the structuring of society in class terms, if it is not to become an ossifying ideological mask. Amongst our political and intellectual classes, it seems to me that the focus on identity thinking, on national identity thinking, with its accompanying philosophical idealism, is still with us. It has been precisely the separation of intellectual concerns that I noted earlier that has made this persistence possible. In my own field of literary and cultural studies, if I look at the major trends of the last several decades, arguments like those over historical revisionism, movements or intellectual collectives such as the Crane Bag. Crane Bag was a journal of the 70s and 80s which seemed to, for a while, to be the mainstream intellectual journal of the country, or the Field Day Theatre Company with its productions and pamphlets and anthology. If we look at something like the rise of supposedly radical intellectual theories or methods such as those of post-colonialism, all of these in Ireland anyway have suffered from the same crippling focus on national identity, whether they wish to damn it or whether they wish to endorse it or reconstruct it. And they've been content not to discuss the culture of the country, broadly speaking, in dialectical relation with the society, state, and economy, as a properly Marxist criticism might do. This obviously is not to slight the intellectual power of the field day critics like Kybert and Dean. It's not to slight the scholarly verve of the Roy Fosters or Joe Lees or whoever of the historiographical world. But it is, in fact, to say that these people all actually share significant ground, no matter how bitterly they at times seem to contest that ground between them. We also must take stock of the weaknesses and the confusions on the Irish left, it seems to me, when it comes to matters of intellectuals and culture. In the cultural sphere, in the literary sphere particularly, we have a striking lineage, a striking inheritance of writers who identify themselves with socialism. Wilde, Shaw, O'Casey, Louis Bennett, Desmond Greaves, Stuart Parker. In music, people like Frank Hart or Luke Kelly, Christy Moore, Andy Irvine. Filmmakers like Joe Comfort or Pat Murphy. And yet we on the left have not generated a literary intellectual culture or narrative around these writers and artists. Emigration seems to have long sapped the intellectual resources of the Irish left from the 19th century onwards. Irish labour history remains, unfortunately, I think, a minority interest. Irish Marxist historiography is even rarer, except in its heavily revised orange mode, if you want. I'm sure we all know what I'm referring to there, okay? We have had no serious sociology of culture. This country that considers itself to be quintessentially literary and cultured. We haven't had a serious sociology of cultural ideas or ideas in this country. To compare even with F.R. Leavis or the Journal of Scrutiny in Britain in the 1930s or 40s, let alone with the German Frankfurt School of Adorno and Benjamin and Marcuse and